Welcome to I Wish You Could Hear This, where we explore great stories and simple proven steps to help you thrive in life, faith, and relationships.
In our research, we've heard hundreds of hope-filled strategies for marriage, parenting, leadership, and life that are grounded in science and consistent with biblical truth. And now you can hear them too.
I'm Shaunti Feldhahn.
And I'm Jeff Feldhahn.
Jenilee Samuel is a busy woman. She and her husband, Stephen, pastor a church, and pastors are actually the busiest people that I know. She also has a fantastic and very popular podcast. She's a podcast coach, and she's a mom. In fact, she is a boy mom. She is surrounded by testosterone with 4 sons and a husband. And she had to learn some serious lessons about how she could both live as a strong and godly woman leader and lift up the men in her life. How does she do this, and what did she have to go through to get to this point? We are going to hear her story and the lessons for any woman who is juggling being a wife and a mom of boys, or actually any husband who wants to support his wife.
So, Jen, thank you so much for joining us on our new podcast.
Oh, absolutely. It's great to be here, and I liked that I should give you the little elbow poke right there.
That happens in church quite often.
Quite often.
So good to be here. Thanks, y'all, for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Jen, I first connected with you on your amazing podcast, Java with Jen. I love the subtitle that you have for it, which is Hearing God's Voice for Everyday Life.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I love that. And I loved so much the insight and just the fact that you're so real and authentic and willing to be very open. So I'm like, we need to have her on our new podcast. So we wanted everybody in our audience to hear from you too.
Yeah. And gosh, Jen, could you give us maybe a peek for our listeners to have a peek into your life, your background, church, family dynamics, all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you mentioned, my husband and I are senior pastors, and we've only been senior pastoring for 1 year. Actually, this Sunday was our 1-year anniversary at the church.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And but we've been in ministry together for 20 years. And then, of course, I grew up in ministry as a missionary kid. And then as a teen, I took ministry in on my own accord. And so I've been in the ministry space for a very long time. And as a woman in a very male-dominated environment, which is ministry, I found myself crying way too much over the fact that there was no pulpits available for me. And so that's when I decided to start a podcast, because I had a very sobering realization that at the end of my life, I'm going to give an account to the Lord, and I don't get to make any excuses or blame anyone for what I did with the gifts inside of me. So that's really where my podcast came from. We had 4 kids along the way before my podcast came about. We had 4 of them in less than 6 years. So that's a whirlwind. I don't really remember much of it. I didn't sleep much. So, but they were all boys. And I grew up with sisters mostly. I had a brother, but he's kind of like this vague figure in the back of my mind. We didn't play with him a whole lot, poor thing. And so I didn't really know what to do with these boys. I just kept thinking, what is wrong with y'all? Like, I just didn't understand how they worked. And so your book has helped quite a bit. Thank you very much for writing your book.
You're very sweet. Which one?
The For Women Only. Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Gotcha. About the men.
About the men.
But as we know, little boys tend to grow up into to become men. So a lot of the things that we still have going on as men were baked in the cake from the earliest times.
Yeah, it's kind of important to start understanding this. Okay, so speaking of starting to understand, so first thing I want to just sort of jump in with you to sort of help our audience get a sense for how things went. When you and Stephen got married, did you think, oh, I've got this, I understand him, or was it, who are you and who is this person? Like, how did things go in those early years?
Okay, so I thought I was well prepared for marriage because I had gone to Bible school and I had read all kinds of marriage books, and I was very much like learn the things and show up and conquer the mountain, and I get married.
You know what? I can't see that in you at all, Jen. I just...
Yeah, so I literally felt like I was going to be prepared, but my dad was a real quiet type personality, so I didn't realize how much I didn't know about men until I got married. And my dad was present, but I don't remember having conversations where he's like, here's what you do and don't do it when interacting with a male, So I'm very intentional to have those conversations with my boys. Like, here's what not to do with a woman. Here's how you treat a girl. And anyways, and so when we got married, I just felt, oh my gosh, felt like my world exploded. I was like, what has happened? And it didn't help that my husband and I were long distance the whole time. We didn't really have a season of normalcy in the same city for very long. And so we made things as hard as possible for ourselves just because we like to keep life exciting, I guess. So it was nuts. I had no idea what I was doing.
So what do you mean when you say we try to make things as hard as possible? Like, what were some of the things that you found yourself doing that in retrospect you're like, oh goodness?
Oh my gosh. Well, okay. So for one, we came from very different backgrounds. He was born in India and came here when he was 5. So he was kind of what you call a third culture kid, which is where his home was an Indian home, but he was growing up in America. So he kind of falls in the middle somewhere. And so they call those third culture kids. And so he grew up as a third culture kid. I grew up as a Christian missionary kid. So we had some similarities. We both grew up in ministry. But his family culture was very different and had a lot of toxic elements to it that came with their culture. And my family was had its toxic moments in the beginning, but my mom, did a whole lot of healing and a whole lot of growth. And so my memories of our family was healthy and supportive and safe and encouraging. And so we came from very different backgrounds. So that was one way that I would say we were maybe emotionally and mentally and culturally unequally yoked. Spiritually, we were equally yoked, but all the other areas, unequally yoked. And so that made for a very difficult experience. And then the fact that we were long distance the whole time, kind of living on idealism, thinking, oh, God's in this, he'll take care of the details, rather than the practicals of, maybe you should live in the same city for a couple years before you are committed to actually getting married, just like get to know each other in a normal people environment.
When you look at this, and you said our books helped, right?
Yeah.
The Understanding Men. I don't know if the Understanding Women, the for men only one, helped at all, but one of the things I would love to just ask, because we're talking about being surrounded by testosterone, and for any wife, initially, it's the husband shock.
Yeah.
Right. Looking back at that, what were some of the things that you realized that, it's both sides, but that you were doing and the ways you were approaching him that you're like, okay, in retrospect, that was not the best thing to do?
My poor husband. Okay, so I'm a choleric personality for anyone who understands choleric. I'm choleric sanguine. And so I'm firstly choleric because I have all the choleric weaknesses. And so I'm like, woohoo, I'm on the charts because of my weaknesses. That's amazing. And so I tend to be bossy and direct and forthright. I'm also very prophetic, and so the prophetic side of me is very bossy and direct and black and white, and abrasive. And I have had to work my whole life to be gentle and kind, and I'm a feeler at the same time. So I feel all the things and the fluctuations, and so it's like I've got this whirlwind inside of my head that I'm trying to manage. And so with all of that, I could feel if my husband was off. I could feel if he had walls up. I could feel if he was avoiding me. I could feel if he was angry. I could feel all those things. And so I would be very direct and ask very direct questions, not understanding how he's hearing me and how he's probably processing me. So given the male psyche, we'll just say that, of that constant insecurity of not being enough, he had compounded on that his childhood, where, there was no support, there was a lot of toxicity, a lot of abuse, a lot of rejection. And so he already was very fragile. And so all of that, and I didn't understand how to talk to him in a way that would be careful with that. And so I made just as many messes as he did.
So I can put myself in the shoes of some of the female listeners because, I've been on social media for a while and seen particular groups, that talk about these things with their husbands or their boyfriends. And they go, why does it fall to you as the strong woman to somehow take
Adapt
care of
yourself.
his fragile nature, and his stroke his ego would be a common phrase. Why should you have to do that?
Okay, so I will say, I think part of why it took me so long to come around to start learning more about him was because of that very thing. I didn't like how it felt to feel like I had to stroke his ego to be heard correctly, because it felt manipulating, or or it felt like I was, I don't know, what's the word, making myself ingenuine.
Diminishing yourself?
Yeah, diminishing myself.
And perhaps, as I've heard, treating him like a toddler. Let's just have this conversation as two adults, and you need to just put
Man
on
up.
your big boy pants and take it, buddy.
Yeah. And so the thing that made me come around to actually humbling myself enough to be like, I just need to learn how they work, was the fact that I found myself telling my boys, you have to learn how a woman works if you're going to be able to treat her right. And I was like, if I'm expecting that from them, I should be willing to do the same thing. Like, it's not love for me to not be willing to serve and to get in his world. It's not love for me to expect that but not be willing to offer that. And so that's really what made me come around, but I had to work through a whole lot of my own resistance to that. But I realized I'm guilty. I'm guilty of mistreatment if I'm not willing to learn and study him and honor the way that God has built him and treat that with care. Now, I'm not going to placate to an immature, fragile ego. Like, I'll be like, I'll come back when you're willing to act like a king. Okay, bye-bye. And so I will step away when he's not being the way he should be. But does that answer your question? I hope that answers your question.
It does. And I think it's fantastic. And it is remarkably effective when we kind of put on that learning cap to try to study and understand, rather than telling the other person, you need to be more like this.
Yeah, it is. Well, at the end of the day, I feel like God's image is buried inside of male and female. And I recognize that in our culture, there's kind of a female lib kind of attitude. And I never want to get into the extreme of either one. Like, have women been oppressed throughout history? Absolutely. They're the largest oppressed people group throughout history in all cultures, most cultures. And so
No doubt.
there is some truth to that, of like, women need to be able to find their voice and be treated with equal fairness and stuff like that. But I feel like we cannot let the pendulum go so far the other direction that we lose the center of gravity, which is God's wisdom, and the fact that male and female are both essential to us seeing the image of God. And so if God's image is born in me, it's also born in my husband and my sons. And to understand how they're wired gives me glimpses of how God is built too. Like, God, worship and praise is important to God. And he put that particularly inside of males, the need to be adored and affirmed and appreciated. And women too. And so being able to see it that way is part of what has allowed me to hold space for it without feeling so threatened by the differences.
That's such a good way of putting
fantastic.
it. It's interesting, Jen. One of the things that Jeff has mentioned multiple times that happens when, let's just say, for example, we're speaking at an event and maybe we get a question, we're doing a marriage event, say, and we get a question from the audience that basically is saying, why should I have to, and I'll pick something. We talk about the importance, like, emotionally of that we found statistically for most men, it was like 80-20, of just really feeling the value of being appreciated, like you said, like being affirmed, and someone saying thank you, and often somebody will ask a question, why should I have to say thank you for something that's just his job? It's just his job to put the dishes in the dishwasher. And, there's that, what you were describing wrestling with, what I wrestled with, any strong woman probably wrestles with it. And one of the things Jeff asked a woman at one of those conferences that I thought was really profound was, okay, when your boy, do you have boys? Do you have boys or girls? Okay, I have a son. Okay, so when your son grows up and he gets married, would you want his wife to ask that question? Or would you want his wife to just say, I love this guy, so I'm gonna try to learn what he needs and appreciate him for who he is and what he wants to be appreciated for. And it's really interesting. Whenever Jeff asks that question, you kind of see the
softening.
Yeah, well, you see the light bulb go on, and then you see the softening, usually. Because we all want that for our boys.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. I remember when my oldest son was young, this was kind of one of the first light bulb moments of how important affirmation is to them. And he was barely old enough to talk. He was 2 years old maybe. And normally we would put him in the car seat and he would help me buckle himself in. And I would say, "Good job, Judah." And I would close the door and get in the car. Well, that day I was on the phone. And so I'm like, on the phone trying to do the things. And he does it. And I just close the door and I get in. And I get in the car and he's having a meltdown. And I was like, and he's a very peaceable child. He's a firstborn peacemaker. And so he's having a meltdown. And I was like, "What the heck is wrong with you, kid?" And so I was like, "Did I pinch your finger? Like, what's going on?" And he was like, "You didn't say good job." And I was like, "Oh, good job, Judah." And then he was fine, And so I was like, holy cow, this is, I didn't even notice he noticed that I was saying good job, And so it became very eye-opening to me how much those little affirmations care for their souls, and even to the women that ask, like, "Why should I have to do that?" My sister has said the same thing. "Why should I have to, act like he's Superman just because he put the dishes away? I put them away 12 times a day," And I feel like we have to evaluate where that's coming from. It's like, you don't have to, but what kind of climate do you want in your home?
Right.
We don't have to choose love, but when we do, life is just a lot better. So.
That's fantastic.
Jeff always says, when he's often talking to the guys, right, about understanding women, like at an event or whatever, and he's, sometimes the guys are like, "What? I don't get it." And he's like, and sometimes you can tell that guys are like, "Oh gosh, I don't know." And Jeff's basically like, "Do you want peace in your home or not?"
Yeah, we're motivated we want things to go well for us.
Yeah.
And if a little bit of understanding and then application of that understanding can help things go well, we're insane to not try.
Yeah.
So I want to pull this back into the surrounded by testosterone for a moment. And one of the big lessons I'd love to talk about, I want to camp out for a bit. Because I think there's a lot of women probably listening to this, and maybe some confused men who are trying to understand their wife.
Actually, it's the confused men type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are confused men. But I was thinking back to what you said about your dad, where he was kind of quiet and he didn't kind of share with you what guys tend to need. The problem is for us guys, we're confused at some level, but it's because we actually don't know what's going on inside of other guys because we don't communicate on those levels too much. So we kind of just think that the stuff that kind of jabs at us or whatever it is unique to us. So we don't necessarily pass that information along to women because we just think, well, maybe I'm just the oddball here. Or we find it difficult to articulate in words that can be understood what it feels like to be a guy, or most guys. So confused guys, yes, and
but
some of it
could just be, processing guys.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So processing guys living together in a house with a strong woman, which most of us are. And I'm curious what you think about, you're a co-pastor. You're a leader. You've got a fantastic podcast. You're in a ministry space as a woman where there's a lot of men. And I'm curious whether you, as a kind of strong and competent woman leader, when you look at what it takes to be a woman leader, and then what it takes to be a wife and a mom to boys, are those two things sometimes in conflict? Is that personality or that temperament or that skill set to be a strong leader and to be a wife and a mom? You know what I'm asking, right?
I am, and I'm thinking about a comment my son made last night, actually. He was like, he made some kind of joke. I couldn't tell it was a joke, and I turned it into a life lesson, of course, And so he was like, "See, Mom, that's why I don't joke around with you. Turn everything into a life lesson." And I was like, I'm sorry, that's the teacher in me. I just see everything in life lessons, And so I've come to realize, like, I pay attention to those comments that they make, because he's saying, I just want to joke around with you, Mom. That's a way that they connect. And I'm realizing, like, especially now that they're all teenagers, I'm trying to really tune in and listen to what are the things that make them want to open up to me and the things that I'm doing that make them not want to open up to me. If I respond with lectures to everything, I wouldn't want to open up to that either, And so just trying to self-evaluate. But as far as the dynamic of being a strong leader and a mom, I do have to intentionally take off my pastor hat when I come home and just kind of listen, hold space. And part of the way that I keep the vision in front of me of doing that is by constantly learning and, listening to podcasts where they're talking about how to care for your teenager or whatever, and trying to constantly stay informed on just how to care for my boys in a way that's relevant. Because yes, I can absolutely cross and blur those lines, and they're like, I don't want Pastor Mom right now. I just want a mom, and they don't say that.
It's funny. I'm reminded of a sermon that I heard Andy Stanley. I was listening to a podcast, the North Point podcast, and I was listening to Andy talk about kids and parenting. And he mentioned in the podcast, and this was what got me, he said, Shaunti Feldhahn did some research on parenting and what teens want their parents to know. And he said, Sandra and I really took this to heart. And one of the things was, instead of the life lesson or the lecture that comes from, when the kid is sharing something, go, okay, that's interesting. Show no emotion at all, either excitement or displeasure, and just kind of keep it very flat. And he said, and it is remarkable what they will tell you. And he said, Sandra and I, through their teen years, would look at each other and go, can you believe they're telling us this? Because they felt safe, and that's what the kids kind of want. And I don't think it's male. In just male. I think it's male and female.
Well, you're talking about the For Parents Only research
exactly.
study, and that was both boys and girls.
Correct.
Yeah.
So.
But
that's very aligned with what Dr. Caroline Leaf has said in an episode that I listened to. She was like, in their stage from, like, I think it's 12 to 15 or maybe even a little younger, she said their bodies undergo so much change that it's actually biologically the most stressful season of their entire humanhood, their whole lifetime. And she said what they need the most is to be heard, because they're growing into adulthood and trying to find their way, and they're aware that they don't understand how the world works, and they're trying to navigate it. And so they want to be able to process their new thoughts and ideas in a space where they can feel heard and maybe get a little bit of reflection, but feel like they can own what they're saying without being parented.
But how hard is that for someone who already has a frontal lobe developed? When you can see consequences down the road. I mean, that's just, it's so hard to hold that off. I'm not saying that you hold all advice off, but it is kind of challenging as a parent.
It is. I do find, though, that asking questions makes them feel heard, but it also allows me to kind of draw out their heart sometimes and, like, help them dig a little deeper. But even that, I have to phrase my questions in a way that don't sound or feel loaded.
Give us an example of what you just said. Asking a question in a way that doesn't feel loaded, or that actually give us both, one that does and one that doesn't.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So, one that might feel loaded. I have a son who's two sons that are musicians, and the oldest is an adult, but living in our house still in college. And so he's trying to navigate those lines between, I'm an adult, but I'm still under your roof, but I want a lot of freedom, but I have to be at home at a certain time, and so it's a little hard. And so we're trying to give him the freedom to explore what his personal boundaries are. So as a musician, he loves going to concerts. And, there's a whole lot of concern in the music industry and what is in the music industry these days. And so when it comes to him choosing certain concerts, or he has the opportunity to go play with a band at a bar. And so the questions then become, okay, how do you feel like if people from church struggle with alcoholism, they're at the bar, they see you there playing music there, what's that going to do to your witness? And so that's really hard to ask those questions in a way that holds them accountable but doesn't make them feel prejudged, but that invites conversation. So a lot of times I will preface my questions with my heart and just communicating my heart, and I'll be like, listen, I'm just asking this because I want to help you think through this, and I really want to hear your heart on this. So I'm just going to ask some questions. Is that okay? And they're like, yeah, sure. And so kind of prefacing my heart, since people don't know our hearts unless we tell them, right? And so just prefacing those questions helps quite a bit. But I also try to be really honest with my kids, and whether it's in question asking or just processing things together. Like yesterday with the same son, I told him, I was like, hey, sometimes it feels like when we put boundaries up, or we say, hey guys, we're going to have family time at such and such date at such and such time. I said, it feels like your initial response is always to kick back. Like you have a resistance or a defiance almost to being told what to do. And he was like, well, I don't. And I was like, okay. And I was like, well, maybe it's just in the communication. And so I'll just ask questions like, when you said this, how do you think that probably came across to us and your brothers? He's like, oh, well, maybe defiant. And I was like, okay, maybe would have been a better way, because this is how it hit me. And so just kind of talking really open and sharing my honest feelings with my teenagers, those conversations have been the most effective, because I'm kind of bringing myself to their level in some regards, in that I'm being vulnerable and I'm being honest, and vulnerability and honesty invites more vulnerability and honesty.
You know what I'm hearing? That's really, really interesting, and I hadn't really thought of it until just hearing you process this as a boy mom, is that, what Jeff was saying earlier, that even experienced adult men don't always know what they're thinking and feeling. And obviously our teenagers, that means they're even more so trying to figure out what they're thinking and feeling. It's almost like you as a mom are helping them develop that skill. Your curiosity, what I'm hearing is curiosity, and genuine curiosity that's prefaced by, hey, can we talk about this? Do I sort of have permission to raise some of these questions with you? It's almost like it puts them in a learning mode themselves, and it helps them be curious themselves about what they're thinking and feeling as a boy, which can only, I would imagine, only help once you get a little bit older, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And you're teaching them to practice kind of speaking the words out loud, because here's what happens sometimes, and it used to happen much more frequently with Shaunti and me, in that we would have something, she would feel slighted, it's something wrong, I would feel slighted, whatever it was. I would retreat into my own mind. She wanted to talk about it. I didn't. But that didn't mean that I pushed it off my, mental plate. Instead, I had a conversation in my mind, what she would have been saying, or I thought she would have been saying. Always, I was kind of misrepresenting her in my mind to make her the less positive one in the conversation, and I always looked, reasonable. And what you're training, you're teaching your boys is that you can't retreat into that dialogue in your head, because it's not accurate. You need to articulate words. You need to use words out loud with your mom, with your soon-to-be, hopefully, spouse.
Well, it's almost like what I'm hearing is, one of the things that we found, and you may remember this, Jen, For Women Only and for Men Only, is that men and women tend to process differently. Now, it's obviously there's exceptions to this, but, that kind of 80-20 rule, I can't remember what the numbers were, but it was similar to that, where most men tend to be more likely to process internally, and women are more likely to process verbally, and it's just because of the brain wiring. But one of the consequences of that in marriage is that you go away and you process something, and you come back and your wife starts asking questions, and you're like, I'm not prepared to talk about it. I've made all the internal decisions. I don't know how to talk about it. And it's almost like that you always say that's a different type of processing. Like when I go away to process internally, I, as a guy, have to sort of be going, not just what do I think about this, but how do I talk about it with her? And so it's almost like what Jen is saying is you're helping your boys learn that in advance.
That's my goal. Because to be honest, that was one of our biggest issues in our marriage,
Really?
me and my husband. And
Tell us
because
about this.
because he grew up in an abusive environment, and they didn't know how to hold space for people's emotions. Like, I mean, just some horrible stories of the boys would ask for shoes, and the way their dad would react was violent and abusive, and then he'd go get them shoes. So it was like unreasonable amounts of conflict that he just learned. Don't have emotions. Emotions become a threat in the home. And so as an adult, literally, if we would have a conflict, it would take him 3 days to process what he was feeling. And even then, when he would process it, usually I was the bad guy. And so he still didn't know how to take ownership of his own emotions. And I realized how much, like, when I was teaching my boys how to own their emotions, how to articulate their feelings, I was teaching my husband at the same time in many ways. And that was thankfully a strength I brought into our marriage, because my mom taught us how to do that very intentionally. She taught us, in a conflict, and you sit down, you talk it out, you seek to understand, and then to be understood. So you always lead with listening, lead with really wanting to understand their heart, because they're not your enemy. The problem is the enemy. They are here to help you solve the problem. And so I came in with those tools, but I very quickly recognized he did not have those tools. And so my goal has always been to teach my boys this. So even when we would read storybooks together, I'd be like, okay, Teddy Bear did blah, blah, blah. Teddy Bear climbed to the tree and had a picnic all by himself. And I was like, how do you think Teddy Bear was feeling in that
Interesting.
moment? I would try to teach them empathy on purpose, because I didn't want them to not have those tools going into marriage, because I knew how harmful it was to my soul to try to work through that. And so I hope that they're learning that. I have found that, there was one time, for example, that my boys they just got into this pattern of making kind of off-color jokes for a season. And I was starting to feel, degraded in my own home. And because of the types of jokes that they were making. And for a while, I was like, I was just kind of working around it. And then I was like, what the heck? This is my home. I'm in charge of the culture here. This is not okay. And so I sat them all down and I was like, boys, we're going to talk about this. And so I laid some very firm boundaries. And I was like, you are not going to make jokes about this, but here's why. And so we went to the scripture and we pointed out what the scripture says about how our language should be. But then I just talked to them as a woman. And I said, guys, I'm a woman. And here's how it makes me feel when you're making jokes like that. And I was like, when I was single, I never would have dated a guy who made off-color jokes, ever. Because that told me he had a perverted heart. And I'm not going to marry someone with a perverted heart. And so they listened so intently, and we talked for like an hour. But I think because I wasn't lecturing and making them the bad guy, I was explaining the why and explaining my heart and giving them insight into the woman's psyche, that instantly that changed in our home. And of course we did tell them if I heard a joke like that, they were coming for a month. That probably helped a little too. But I asked one of my sons, Benjamin, I said, are conversations like that actually helpful for y'all? And he goes, yeah, they really are. And I said, okay. And so whenever I've sat and just shared my heart as a woman, they really sit up and listen. And so that vulnerability again hits them differently than a lecture.
I love that. You know what that really does that is so encouraging is I think in today's culture, there's been a bit of a myth that has built up that men just don't care about that. That they just don't care about, what women think, or, there's a kind of, okay, roll your eyes. I gotta, listen because that's what a guy is supposed to do. Actually, I think in our research, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of men really do love their wife. They want to serve their wife well. They want to be a good husband. They want to be a good dad. Yeah. But it's just there are these differences and it's really helpful, Jen, to hear how you navigate them. Just as we kind of start wrapping up, I'm curious, what's the hardest thing? And this is probably an unfair question to pop on you, but I'm going to say it anyway. What do you think the hardest thing is that the Lord has asked you to do as a woman who is surrounded by testosterone?
Stay married. That's been the hardest thing. And that not so much, I think, because of testosterone. I think that just because of the broken spaces that my husband carried in our marriage. And so staying married was genuinely the hardest thing the Lord has ever asked me to do. But I think being able to step back when things hit pitch fever, and I was like, I'm not going to make it. Like, I'm just literally not going to make this. Being able to step back and carve out space to like protect my own heart, heal my own heart, refresh my soul, and learn about boundaries. I didn't understand boundaries. I had a very super religious perspective on boundaries. And when I finally began to implement boundaries within my marriage, in our relationship in a healthy way, with the understanding that boundaries are the lines I draw so I can safely love you and safely love me at the same time. When I would implement those kind of boundaries, it provided the safety I was looking for. It put the responsibility of my husband's actions back on his shoulders, so he had to face his own demons, and gave me the respite to be able to heal. And then as I healed, finally I could begin to have the capacity to take up the learning hat again and say, okay, so now what can I be doing? Because for a while, when you're just feeling destroyed on the inside, you don't even have the capacity to try to figure out how to do any differently. You're just trying to make it. And that's where I lived for a very long time. And so being able to step back into learning, how can I show up for them differently? That was a sign of my own growing health and wholeness. And so that was a big deal. So that was the hardest thing.
That's fantastic.
Thank you for being so honest,
really,
and transparent about that.
In that brokenness, in our case, when Shaunti and I got married, she was broken, and I was broken, because we're part of a broken world. And what staying married, even though both of us were broken, what I found is that brokenness from Shaunti's past made her into the person she is now that I love. So it's not just the brokenness that makes things hard. Sometimes if you can persevere through and get on the other side
in a healthy way,
that brokenness is part of the person that's wonderful in your life and in your marriage, and gives such joy. So I love the stay married thing, because I'm sure Stephen, as amazing as you are, he might have Jen was broken in a way or two, and we stayed married, and that brokenness in her is part of the beauty that she is now.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a richness in the relationship, and he is definitely, oh my gosh, definitely not the same person that I married. Praise God, we wouldn't still be married if he was the same person I had married originally. We just wouldn't. I would have not survived it, and so I'm thankful that he chose the path of humility to learn how to heal his own soul. He just hadn't taken the time to heal his own soul from his whole childhood. And so as we kind of walked that path together, I can appreciate who he is, because I can see how far he has come, and then I can appreciate how he has helped me grow and heal as well. And me just breaking off some really religious thinking, some really broken thinking, that was not serving me or him. And so staying married. Now, I will say, I do not advocate for people staying married in abusive relationships.
We don't
I
either.
don't. No. And it's really hard to identify sometimes. If there's not bruises, it's hard to identify that if you're in one. But the Lord knew what he was doing, and knew how to help me carve out space along the way to find safety and emotional safety. And so
I love that you can carve out, even in a difficult marriage, that you can carve out that space to work on yourself, ask the other person to work on them. And it could be either the man or the woman, right? Ask them to work on themselves. And then as you heal, I love that. As you heal, then you can start to like grow and figure out what you need to work on?
Last thing that I'll chip in here is
I know we need to wrap it up. I've loved talking to you, Jen.
Is a story that a friend of ours, a couple friend that we get together for dinner regularly, and they have kids roughly in the same ages as our kids, so early 20s. And the daughter of this friend couple was saying, when I get married, I want to marry someone just like Dad, Mom. And the mom looked at her and said, what you're seeing is a man after 30 years of marriage. That wasn't the man that I married. There was a whole lot of rough edges that ended up getting smoothed off, and he became this man.
And both people.
Both.
It's both of us that applies to.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Jen,
100%.
we always want to end with kind of a one takeaway kind of thing. What's based on what we've been talking about today, and candidly based on your life story and being surrounded by testosterone and all the things you've gone through, what would be your one big takeaway that you would want people to, that you would want our listeners, the lesson, the practical point that you think God would want people to hear?
I think this is going to be really practical. One thing that my husband had said to me when we were working out a conflict, and this was where I had to learn to do it differently. And he said, when you just are expressing how I've hurt you, but you're just coming at me, like coming at what I did, and just, I was in kind of venom mode. and he's like, when you come at me like that, he's like, I can't hear anything you're saying. He goes, but if you'll just use the phrase, because he goes, it makes me want to defend myself and fight you. He was like, but if you'll use the phrase, you're hurting me, or you hurt me, then he's like, then I want to protect you. And so it allows me to hear you differently if you can use that phrase, you're hurting me. And so I was like, okay, that's really fair assessment. And so between that phrase and even just in conflict in general, when there's conflict, we tend to react, but we have found that one way to diffuse it really quickly and call that person's heart back into love is to just say, would you talk to me like you love me? Talk to me like you love me.
Either of you say that.
And so saying that, either of us, yes. And I'll say that to my teenage boys sometimes, can you talk to me like you love me? And the boys, this is the funny side, the boys recognized that when their dad would pick up his watch and talk to Siri, he would talk really politely to Siri. And so their version of it is, Dad, can you talk to me like you talk to Siri?
Awesome.
And so, but just, something like that kind of, we don't realize how we're coming off typically to our loved ones in those heated moments. And so being able to just say, hey, can you talk to me like you love me? You're hurting me. It diffuses things so quick and pulls their heart back into action to protect and to honor you.
I love that. Well, so I think on today's episode of I Wish You Could Hear This,
we've learned a lot. Shaunti and Jeff have.
And the thing we probably most want you to take away, at least sort of the way that I'm thinking about this, the thing we most want to take away is there is a way to approach even a difficult situation with someone who's very different from you.
Very different.
And that could be your husband, it could be your wife, it could be your kids if they're the opposite gender, it could be anybody. There is a way to approach someone who is very different from you, but in a way that touches their heart, and that also allows you to grow. I think that's what I'm hearing. It's both sides. So anyway, Jen, how can people find you in your ministry?
Absolutely. If they want to connect, of course, everything related to me is going to be Java with Jen Podcast online. So it's javawithjenpodcast.com to find resources that I have. I have a number of freebies online, whether you want to start a podcast and coach with me, or whether you want to learn more about hearing God's voice. I've got free resources on both sides. And so that's at javawithjenpodcast.com. Otherwise, of course, my podcast, Java with Jen Podcast.
Thanks to Jenilee, which is your official name, Jenilee Samuel, for coming on the show today. So we're going to encourage everybody, check out Java with Jen, and you can see her details. We'll put those in the show notes. Please share today's episode and tag Jen Samuel on all your social media channels. Thanks for listening to I Wish You Could Hear This. Remember to subscribe to our podcast. And as always, forward today's audio or video link to a friend, counselor, or pastor who would be encouraged.